Ah, the familiar story of an arcade game from the 80s and 90s ported over to a home console at the time only to find out, wow, this isn't the same experience. This isn't fun. This isn't good. What happened to the game I enjoyed playing? Thus begins my retrospective of Xenophobe on the NES from Sunsoft, which is a port of a quirky arcade cabinet by Bally Midway. So let's talk about the arcade game for a moment, as this lays the foundation for what's going to be the port to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Xenophobe, the arcade game, was a three-person co-op shooter that actually split the screen 3 ways for the players. The arcade cabinet used these flight sticks as well, like joysticks that I first remember as a kid on the old Tron cabinets, modified of course. The game setting was a tongue-in-cheek spoof of the 60s Star Trek meets Aliens. And the likenesses of some of the things in this game is almost spot on. I wonder if any lawsuits were ever brought up. This game was also co-designed by Brian Collin, who also worked on other arcade classics such as Rampage and Arch Rivals. So from the get-go, this game had the pedigree to be worth your time and money. So let's go ahead and jump into the actual NES port of this title. I will say most of the feel for the game is there, well almost. You basically have to kill a certain number of aliens before moving on. In the arcade game there was a time limit too, but in the NES version I didn't see it anywhere. You keep going until the screen starts flashing one of its 4 colors, and then you find a button to teleport out of the level. You can also use these same buttons to teleport to different areas of the map too. Another thing, you can crouch and crawl forward while still firing. This was one of the first games I can remember you can do this, except maybe the aforementioned Rampage. I know all this sounds basic and commonplace today, but it was a really novel concept for its time. But unlike other versions of this game, you cannot fire at an angle in the NES version. I will say the controls are actually really decent for a 2-button setup. One button will fire your weapon, while the other button acts like an action button. This action button is like your jump, pick up items, and interact all in one, and it does the job pretty well. But one thing to take note of, when you jump in this game, you must commit, as you can't control your character after you launch. And your jump is kind of slow, making you vulnerable to attacks. Maybe it's a space thing. When you start this game, you get to select from one of 3 characters. In other versions, you can select one from 9, from 3 different color sources, red, blue, and yellow, just like the older versions of Star Trek. But in the NES version, you're limited to the colors of bland, blander, and utterly tasteless. And you get to select from a mutant duck, a guy whose head looks like a wad of chewing gum, and a one-eyed pirate maybe? After selecting your character, the first thing that jumped out to me was the visuals. They were as insipid as a bowl of cold mashed potatoes. I know the NES had limited detail compared to its arcade counterpart, but it feels like Sunsoft only used the pastel Easter M&M's color palette. The sound is another downer to me, as it made the game feel a little lifeless. The sound bites used sound very dated, as if borrowed from a previous Atari generation. And hell, maybe it was, as the game did come out on various versions of the Atari. The arcade didn't have much of a soundtrack, but it had what I felt like more of an ambiance, as the action was always going. Here it's a blip or a bleep every few seconds. This may keep pace with something like Pong, but here it really took me out of the experience. One thing I'd like to mention is that your health is measured via a number like hit points. At the time, this was a little different, as most games were on the one hit and die or a health bar. The difficulty of this game I would say is a little bit above normal. Not real difficult, but it's almost impossible not to take damage. This game is easier with more players, and that's what I really like about games in this era. Typically, you want to play with more than one person and work together, even though 2 players can totally go off on their own and get into all kinds of trouble. And that too has a unique appeal for this game. So let's talk about the fun factor to this game. Ultimately, I think it depends on if you're playing alone or with a friend. Doing the solo, the fun waned on me only after a few hours, as the game gets repetitive and just doesn't live up to its arcade counterpart. However, I can see this game being a fun weekend game pickup with a friend. But before you do it, I've seen some crazy prices going for this NES port. I say you and a friend should get no more than $20 together. Spend around $5 for the loose cart and the rest on beer and have a fun Friday night killing aliens. And that was my take on Xenophobe. So what did you guys think? Have you played it before? Any different versions that I have played? Let me know below. Also, I stream at nights on various platforms, so why not follow me on Twitter? That way you know when I'm going live. And don't forget to have a great day and a better one tomorrow.